Hello everyone, today we talk about the origins of the Gregorian Reforms and try to look which factors influenced and brought the Church towards the direction of the set of reforms. Telling you the truth, it wasn't really a reform as it's often named, and these prodromes are important to understand because you realize also in here that history might have taken another path. The Gregorian Reforms stemmed from a very precise background that was built up by several factors, several movements, several thoughts, new ideologies, and it's not something that popped out of the blue without any particular reason, but the mere ideal of the reform of the Church. But also we have to look at the same Christianity and its experiences during the 11th century to better understand the same meaning of the Gregorian Reforms as they were influenced by this. So, as you know, the 11th century was this decisive period for the affirmation of a centralized organization of the Church. This was based on a monarchical model. Reason for which we talk about the papal monarchy. I made some video about that, also talking a little bit about the prodromes, especially into Italy and Tuscany, and how also the Ottonian rule and had influenced this the process of reformation of the Church, focusing especially also on the monasteries that had a very big role into this, and today we will look at that a bit more broadly. So the decentralization of the Church, as we were saying before, was a non-linear and actually non-organical process. It was strongly influenced by certain, even dramatic events that cannot be described as just, in two parties, as if, from one side there were the reformers and from the other the conservatives, let's say. It was actually pretty much intermingled, and the reason of this reformation of the Church wasn't really conceived as even initially as a true organic process. There was not a project behind that initially that said, okay, now we have to do this and that. It was there were even sudden and unexpected events that time after time oriented the action of certain pontiffs towards that direction. So a very important contribution to the renewal of the Church came from the monastic world, as we were saying. Within some monasteries, even more than among the bishops, telling the truth, it was felt the need to give back to the Church her prestige and moral credibility, in order to allow her to defend more effectively her position as the guide of Christianity. And contrarily to what is being often said, this so-called monastic reform didn't really go against the riches and the properties of the Church. On the contrary, the Gregorian Reforms put a lot of emphasis on the material wealth of the Church, because this had to represent the greatness, the splendor of the same institution, and they were completely legitimate. This is also a very important genetic character that would shape the ecclesiastical organization at this time. The riches were considered as a sort of image of earthly glory of the Church, and this goes actually beyond the same problem of property, or better, the idea is such material wealth, material power was somehow a distinctive character of a strong church, as much as it was hierarchically organized. So we can see that even in the following centuries, the church would have kept this exterior splendor, even against those instances that were claiming for a new reform of the church. These are this was a criticism that the church was moved throughout all its history now, in a measure or in another. So at this time, the Gregorian Reforms kind of set up a very stable trend that basically the church will not renounce to for a very long time. Think about the Reformation in the 16th century and how that the wealth of the church was one of the first reasons of criticism towards the Church of Rome, because this had been from the 11th century perfectly absorbed as a normal structural factor in the church. So that the Counter-Reformation also tried to, not really to diminish even the exterior effect of the church as a model for the religious community, but let's say at least to decrease this excessive ostentation of wealth, or at least to make it a bit more framed into a more spiritual pattern in some fashion. So naturally, also after those centuries, the church has kept a great material power, and this went along with a tradition that evidently was pretty much rooted, as the Church of Rome especially had reached historically an enormous power that was functional to a political and not just religious system into which Europe was practically organized. So the Roman Church had to maintain an authority of some sort, also as an international player, a sovereign national player, telling the truth, and therefore stressing its universalistic prerogatives that, especially toward the modern age, were declining. So the so-called monastic reform at this point, more than the contesting the wealth and properties of the church, had the intention to extend to the whole church the monastic model. Now this is very important because especially if you understand what the monastic model is, the monastic model is essentially ideally the model of the heavenly Jerusalem. Monasticism, we haven't really been talking much about monasticism on a channel chiefly dedicated to medieval history, but now we will have to do it in some fashion soon. But let's say monasticism is conceived as this not as a heavenly model, definitely, as a sort of the monastic community has to be organized in a fashion that resembles, of course, the perfection of the heavens, but it's still not fully detached from the earth and from the communities. Medieval monks were not isolated from the community. Not even before the spread of the mendicant orders in the cities. Even the rural monasteries were always in contact with society, and not just because these monasteries, especially at this time, we're talking about were essentially political and also military players sometimes, and they were administered by noblemen, essentially, as most abbots and also the bishops, as for in the diocese, were essentially aristocrats. They were coming from the aristocratic world, but also to. But on the contrary, the idea was to be that the monastic community had to be visible, so that the faithful could look at that and potentially being attracted, of course, so eventually entering even into the monastic communities, but also trying to maintain that order also as a model for instance, the political authorities. And with the Gregorian Reforms will begin de facto also the struggle for investitures, even if this problem had already existed in practice, and actually also on other levels than strictly the investitures of bishops, etc. But and the idea was that the monastic world had theoretically eventually to take over the world, and this had been an ancient tension of monasticism. I mean, the idea that the world, ideally, following a Christian model, had to eventually transform itself radically. The monastic experience, in this sense, has always been sort of a radical experience, because it implied the renunciation to much of the earthly world. So it was strongly detached from, at least in theory, from politics. It was. It would have been interesting to see how a world ruled into a monastic fashion would have worked. But this naturally was, and in a certain sense, the medieval world had kind of accepted the divisions of roles in this sense. This stemmed essentially from the needs of the community as a whole. I mean, obviously, not everyone could be a monk, or at least the idea was that there had to be other actors in the world. Then, of course, in following times, things like monastic orders, where military monastic orders would be born. There would be even certain types of lifestyle that were a bit a hybrid between a monastic life and a secular life. But the Middle Ages are kind of expressed in this segmentation, the famous segmentation between the oratores, the bellatores, and the laboratores, for instance. Even though the Benedictine model was still part of the one of the laboratores as well, because the Benedictine monks at this time were the only monks existing, because more or less, there were different monasteries, different interpretations of Saint Benedict's rule, but ideally by this time in the 11th century all the monks were feeling of themselves as Benedictines. And that Saint Benedict's rule was stressing the importance of work. That also stems from a particular context when the rule was written down in during the 6th century into a world that was pretty much declining. So there was even especially the need of of survival, of having to plug the land in order to do something about it. But was it derived from a strictly pragmatic reason. Now, at this time, by the 11th century, the monks worked, but in a different way. It had been like that. But even in this, what it was maintained was the ideal that through the work, the monastery had to literally transform even the earth into something different, something organized in a divine fashion. All these let's say the monasteries at this time were quite powerful, so they had a lot of land, they organized it, they worked on it, they produced a lot. So this was seen as essentially a form of a broader organization that from the monasteries had to extend to the whole world, and relatively to the Gregorian Reforms, such expansion could occur from had to occur from the top. So from the highest hierarchies of the church, that at this time, by the way, were not still very clear what they had to be, because Rome at this point had naturally a huge power, huge prestige already. But something that is difficult to understand is that previously to the 11th century, really the Roman Church wasn't really, it was written nowhere that the Roman Church had to be essentially at the head of all the other churches. It was more conceived as a moral. It had this primacy of charity, as it was said, because of the role that naturally it had with St. Peter, St. Paul, etc. But the hierarchical asset of the church was something that, traditionally speaking, had never been really claimed. There were these metropolitic seats that were organized mostly for administrative reasons, and of course they had some, since the beginning, certain ideology related to the fact that they were important centers, also as death place of the apostles, etc. The only one was Constantinople, that didn't have a past like that, and rather brought relics from the Christian world to achieve that status. But in this sense, even the metropolitic seats and other, mostly metropolitic seats were actually in competition with each other, and in the original organization of the church, none of these was meant to be the head of the church. So behind the Gregorian Reforms, you have to understand also this idea of verticizing the church in a certain sense. So putting the Roman Pope at the head, and from this really organizing the not just what the diocese of Rome was, therefore what was owed to the single Roman bishop, but really reorganizing the whole world, and therefore emanating this model of this divinely inspired model that had to organize progressively the whole globe according to that fashion. Naturally, this was also ideal. It's always been ideal, naturally, as the church is a human institution, so it can't be what is a perfect community. Also in Christian terms, this is not possible. But you can imagine how this had so many practical implications. This means that the Roman Church has a huge power in the first place, and it already had, by the way. So it's not it was not random that this would start from Rome naturally. Think about the role that Rome had now traditionally in crowning the emperors in the West. So whoever wanted to be emperor had this unavoidable passage of being recognized by the Pope as such, to be crowned by the Pope as such. And the Reformation of the Church had definitely stemmed from the interference that imperial power had increasingly achieved on the Roman Church, especially during Ottonian times, into which the Ottonian dynasty was trying essentially to curb the influence of the local aristocracies into the management of the church, and to make not much the church really epurated from, but really making it subservient to the imperial authority in some measure. Then obviously not even the Ottonians ever achieved such an immediate subordination of the church to the imperial power, but at least they had gone close to that, and this had much greater implications also into the local secular life. I made a video recently that is called The Ottonians and the Kingdom of Italy, in which I discussed essentially how the control of that the Ottonians obtained on the Italic Church was a mean also to curb the local aristocracies that were incidentally the ones that up to that point had provided the major, from which the major ecclesiastical figures had come from. So basically the properties of the church at this point were being progressively absorbed and managed by imperial power, and keeping the local aristocracies out. Now, this is something that was not liked. The Roman aristocracies didn't like this, for instance. Also, the rest of Italy was pretty, upset about this, so that naturally the political game was a bit more intricate, but definitely towards the end was a strong. But this, however, favored the same reformation of the church from the same church now, because the church was being transformed by the Ottonians in something increasingly autonomous. The Ottonians began to give the church certain communal power that theoretically didn't have to have. Naturally, the church and the bishops had obtained this even before the Ottonians arrived into Italy, through their power, especially their role of prestige they had within the local communities, the urban communities, sorry. But now, paradoxically, even if the church had grown subservient to the imperial authority, however, it had been increasingly distinguished from the local aristocracy. So this was a very important factor that triggered the Gregorian Reforms, because it's as if the church had already been distinguished and reformed, as a matter of fact, by the same Ottonians from the local aristocracies, and transforming in something more autonomous. Then naturally, in the future, it's not that the church was detached from, from the local nobility. Think about how the Roman nobility was important in providing figures like, Innocence III or Boniface VIII that I discussed in my videos. In some of my videos, you can, if you're interested about these topics, I advise you to check out the Medieval Christianity playlist. That is pretty hefty, and it's been, made a couple of videos on these very topics. But the importance here was making of the church a sort of autonomous, but not completely independent, ideally, organism, so that naturally the aristocrats could join it and administering it in a way that was not controlled, was not, let's say, subservient to imperial rule, but that on the contrary could influence it, would not command directly imperial rule and secular powers in general, because this was the idea that the church, being universal power, had to control basically the whole world. So all the political authorities that existed in in the world, in the Christian world at least, and then naturally also in here. Think about the Crusades that start from the end of this century. Well, those were conceived in part of the many reasons that actually stemmed the Crusades. They're extremely complex actually to scope. It was partly the idea that Christianity now had to be expanded, even geographically speaking, and that the Pope could call the world Christianity to expand the same Christian world. Now, this was completely something completely abnormal, historically speaking. I mean, the Byzantines, when they realized what was happening in the West now, they couldn't even basically accept it, understand it in the first place. Naturally, they never accepted it, but even from a cultural point of view, they couldn't conceive how a bishop could tell emperors what to do in practice, from a political point of view, from a military point of view. We will analyze this at some point as well. So the major the major speakers, the major spokesperson for this renewal, we can say, were the monks of Cluny. So Cluny, I hope you know, it was this abbey founded at the beginning of the 10th century in Burgundy, by the way, by one of the greatest actually French noblemen of the time, and it was William of Aquitaine, Duke of Aquitaine. And as many other monastic foundations, therefore also Cluny was born as a private monastery. So a monastery that was definitely part of a broader, it wasn't just an ecclesiastical community, it was also a patrimony, something that had a great political meaning, etc., which was basically the average you could find at the time, especially in areas like France that were, to which the aristocracies were particularly powerful and had this control on the world branches of society. So something relatively different from other regions of Europe. At least this was the average pretty much elsewhere, but this could really vary wildly in degree on how much power eventually the local aristocracies really could have. So it's not surprising that Italy after the Ottonians was so different, as a matter of fact, than France. And the Cluniac abbots had the merit, through their very skilled policy of mediation between the local powers and the papacy, to make Cluny a very strong autonomy, thanks to which thanks also to, by the way, to the same William of Aquitaine that basically granted immunity to the same abbey, and to the papal exemption that basically freed the Cluniac monks from a direct dependency from the bishop and therefore their own diocese. This was also very important in triggering the Gregorian Reform into the world Christianity, because basically these very powerful monastic centers that had a very big political weight on their own could basically emancipate themselves from the local ecclesiastical hierarchy by appealing directly to Rome. So the Gregorian Reforms triggered this as well as a process. I mean, the idea that Rome could basically interfere with the local churches all over Europe. Rome had always had this power. I mean, since the late antique time, or think about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons, the coordination, the creation of certain that Rome had with local churches to even convert the local populations, etc. Rome had this role of prestige since always, let's say, into Western Europe, and not only, by the way. And one of the points is that after the let's say the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, the hierarchical Rome had lost part of the control over the Western churches, because these had pretty much autonomized. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Even the Carolingians had tried to reform the church and given a lot of power to the local churches, hoping that basically the church would be able to stamp the aristocratic push for autonomization, but the whole thing failed. Also because the Carolingian church was still made up of the same aristocrats in some part, but this also gave, when the empire collapsed, a much greater power to the local churches that kind of grew extremely powerful, and that's why also in the high and lower Middle Ages, bishops like in these areas of post-Carolingian Europe were also some so powerful. Why they had such an unearthly lifestyle. They had armies, they had lands. I mean, they were princes just like all the others. And this process had naturally been detaching these local, let's say, aristocratic clergymen from the central direction of Rome. Monasteries, and especially these new monasteries that had this sense of, of reform, of also partly of purification of the church, and because of their continuous research of the Christian perfection, on the basis of which the monastic community had been organized, were indirectly criticizing the same milieu they were coming from. So naturally, the Cluniac monks were still part of that aristocratic world that we know it. But being so extremely powerful as let's say autonomous entities as themselves, in order to dislocate themselves among those extremely complicated net of relations, and of political hierarchies that existed, and they started developing increasingly more solidly into kingdoms like France in this case, etc. We're trying to get a stronger bond with Rome, so that they could say, okay, I recognize you like the head of the church. You recognize me as something more autonomous. So we have this private link, and we kind of cover each other's backs in a certain sense. And this was pretty clever. And you understand also why the Gregorian Reforms stemmed partly from the monastic world, because it basically was trying to relieve these very powerful and very ambitious and autonomous monastic foundations from the interference of the local powers. Sometimes even the ones of the same kings or emperors. So this was very, very important. And since, by the way, these monastic communities were expanding all over Europe, having a very powerful net of connection, also based on economy and properties and land, power, etc. This was a way for Rome to reintervene into the local into the local ecclesiastical policy, and reasserting its own prerogatives in the situation. And so the Abbey of Cluny reached an enormous notoriety, also thanks to the life model that the monastery was able to elaborate. And this was based on the so-called liturgical specialization. So certain some of its abbots, some of Cluny's abbots were of extreme intellectual greatness. We have to think of these abbots, as we were saying before, as noblemen that had received out and inside the monastery a great education, who were definitely maintained by this system that could allow them to live, to spend essentially a life of studies. And these, there were some of the greatest intellectual figures of the time among these Cluniac abbots, and they understood the importance to present first towards the local nobles and then towards a much wider array their own monastic community as a group of almost angelic men who, through their own prayers, establish a privileged relation with the afterlife. So naturally, this was aimed at conferring to Cluny a great moral prestige. So you realize this wasn't being done would have not been done just by Rome. Eventually, this idea of the moral prestige of the church naturally was something that dated back to a very long time. It was inherent to the struggle that existed in some measure, in spite of the cooperation that also had always existed between the ecclesiastical and secular powers. The idea that the church has a higher moral dignity from which influencing the Christian community even before then its secular authorities. And this had in 10th century Europe, in 11th century Europe, a great influence all over the Christian world. For instance, it was the same Cluniac monks that elaborated and spread the All Souls Day, that it's today still celebrated to the Christian world on November the 2nd, and to reaffirm the value of virginity as a necessary a necessary requisite, let's say, a necessary requirement for whom wanted to be part of the monastic communities and the community, and in this sense to mediate between the terrestrial and celestial world. This thing of chastity is important because up to that time it was normal even for the I mean, we don't have to make it a sort of an ideological point devoid of because this was done essentially because at the time it was normal for the clergy to have to get married sometimes, and definitely to have children. So this was seen also as part of that form of moral decadence that had struck the church, but it had also broader implications because naturally an abbot, a bishop that have family have tended, especially in that aristocratically dominated world, we can say, a greater interest, for instance, to make of the ecclesiastical office something more than that. So just something sort of career for his family and stuff like that. So these monastic models had actually great success. Cluny had immediately enjoyed a very wide appreciation because even if emphasizing the prayer as the principal vocation of the clergy and the centrality of the latter in the relation between man and God, it, however, still didn't really put into discussion the social order. It was still a model that was saying, okay, yeah, we can still engage the community at every level, even at the aristocratic one, to make the church great, let's say. This is a bit complicated to explain because it seems that it could be also positive terms to the today's that time's society, but it's not really so, because at this point Cluny first of all became one of the richest abbeys in Europe thanks to all the donations that the powerful and that made to it, since it was believed that the Cluniac the prayers of the Cluniac monks had a particular effectiveness in saving the soul. And at the same time, it's the Cluniac order was subtracting itself to the control of the bishops. As we said before, the Cluniac abbots were submitted, let's say, directly to the Pope, to whom they were recognizing his primacy. His first place, let's say, in the ecclesiastical order. So this is how also part of the political equilibrium was being shifted from the strictly local ecclesiastical hierarchies to the monastic communities. This is important also at a strictly geographical level, because the monastic communities were scattered pretty much everywhere, and they had, however, a common rule. So even this hierarchization of this very big and spread organism was slowly providing models for the centralization of the same church. While if there is a bishop of a city, that he remains bishop of that city. and the hierarchical, maybe the bishoprics and the diocese can expand in some way. At this time, the dioceses, the bishops fought against noblemen, against peasants. I mean, there was a dynamism in this sense, so that maybe after these clashes, but not just through war, telling the truth, also through normal patrimonial strategies, the diocese could acquire new land. But more or less, the diocese was stuck to a certain, it was tied to the local territory. It gravitated around the cities. It had this more or less defined harbor into which it could expand. Definitely, the bishops themselves could acquire properties somewhere. I mean, if you think how powerful certain bishops were, you understand what I mean. Especially in certain areas of Germany, they were extremely powerful, and they were also expanding in this sense. But the monastic communities went beyond, because these weren't really part of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. They didn't have, in this sense, public rights. They weren't part of the of this asset that was tied to just one place, to the local trade. It could expand everywhere. It was theoretically something private, but it was theoretically something that could spread without opposing, without challenging local diocese as an authority. Of course it didn't. It couldn't substitute to that. But de facto, they were so powerful that they really had a huge influence all over the territory, from a political, from a social, from an economical point of view. And certain abbots were extremely powerful, as we were saying, also militarily speaking. The abbeys were great production centers. There were lots of people working on monastic estates. So it was the model for it was a net, let's say, that crossed the whole Europe. It was expanding a lot. It was a very successful model, and that found, in this sense, let's say, a channel through which developing that was considered in moral opposition to what the local clergy was really about, in some way, or at least criticizing their lifestyle by saying, okay, we're monks, we have a better rule, we're not so hurtly, we don't get involved so openly and blatantly into local politics, which, you understand, was partly an hypocrisy, because these monks were involved into the local politics as well, and they were making actually something much bigger, because they were, in a certain sense, augmenting the weakness of local powers by saying, okay, now we emerge as well. And for doing this, we ask essentially the permission from Rome, legitimization from Rome, so that Rome has, Rome is still there, we are here, and we can actually all have our business in our respective areas throughout this special bond, and we don't respond to local noblemen, at least the ones that have not to do with our monastic foundation, and we still emanate this kind of purification model that they surely believed in. I mean, you don't have to think it was either just, something about power undetached from actual moral issues, because these people surely believed in their mission, what they were doing. And I'm not a great expert, but it would be interesting also to go a bit deeper into this and try to understand what, for instance, the perspective of a Cluniac abbot was relatively to how the world had to be organized. Maybe we will see that at one point. However, so this net of influence, let's say this net of monasteries, gave birth to a net of priorates. So that they were called in this way because they were entrusted to a prior, that is a sort of vice abbot, and which made up a congregation was destined to influence very deeply in the story of the church up to the 12th century. Cluny and its priorates, so the priorates that were tied to Cluny, were not the only protagonists, let's say, in the monastic renewal between the 10th and 11th century. There were also other factors, naturally. Now, today we can't see everything, but we can make this singular examples. In Italy, for instance, now we have seen France. In Italy, in this same centuries, there was the rise of little monastic communities that basically refused the transformation of many Benedictine abbeys into centers of power. So these monastic communities wanted to recover the ideals of the first monasticism and conjugating them with the hermitism of Eastern tradition. A very important figure in here was the one of Romualdo from Ravenna, who was inspired to the so-called fathers of the desert. He and he founded into central Italy certain let's say isolated communities, certain hermitages that basically were concentrated on this retreat, in this refuge, and to individual ascesis. So sometimes very tough experiences from a strictly even physical point of view. Think about the one of the most important communities from this point of view was the hermitage of the Camaldoli in the Tusco-Romagnol Apennine. And so these hermits had a great influence in the inspiration of other monastic communities. Take the one, for instance, of Valonbrosa in Tuscany. So this monasticism of hermetic inspiration crossed towards the end of the 11th century the Alps and reached also France, that at this time was instead being growing critical and polemicizing against the same Cluny. because of essentially the pomp, the splendor, the ostentation that had come to characterize Cluny and its own priorates. So, close to Grenoble, it was built the Grande Chartreuse, from which eventually began the experience of the Carthusian monks, that even if still living in pretty large abbeys called Chartreuse houses, let's say, they spent a great part of their life in prayer and isolated in their own cell. So you see how this hermitism also represented the revival of certain early monastic instances that had been kind of forgotten into Western Europe during the rise of the aristocracies, and how the sharp contrast that existed between those ancient models and the reality of monasticism, and this of aristocratic monasticism, brought to be revived. So another very important experience was the one of the Cîteaux Abbey that was developed between the 11th and the 12th century through a monastic model inspired to the very first Benedictine experience, and gave life to the so-called Cistercians. From a strictly ideological point of view, there were certain monastic reforming movements that were spread by the critical instances towards the clergy, and that contested especially certain practices that were largely spread at the time, like simony and Nicolaism. So with simony, it was meant essentially the purchase of ecclesiastical charges. A practice that was, especially since the 10th century, was become pretty widespread, and that had definitely contributed to lower essentially the moral level of the clergy. Simony takes the name from this biblical character of Simon Magus, who basically tried to buy from Peter the gift of healing. So this is what the word simony actually means, and so I would like to stress how eventually this criticism towards the church was really felt at the time. I mean, by the same Christian communities, and how these monks were really concerned about changing how the situation was. We have seen it with the same Cluny that favored in part the reformation of the church. Well, the lifestyle, the aristocratic lifestyle, was essentially the albeit with some minor criticism, like towards the that was stressing, for instance, the importance of chastity and all, was essentially still an aristocratic thing. So these movements really were concerned about the correct functioning, let's say, of the church, and were truly interested in making a change at a moral level, because it had to be pretty much evident how the clergy was so much involved into the local politics, how it was essentially an aristocratic business, and how this didn't fit to the ideal model of the church. With Nicolaism, instead, we define another thing that basically in the book of the Revelation, also in here it's not pretty clear. It probably derived from the name of a deacon called, in fact, Nicholas, and Nicolaism indicated those people were favorable to concubinate and of the marriage of the clergymen, of the clergy, as it was. We have seen how it was widespread, actually, largely around the 11th century. So the chastity model that had been proposed by other fathers of the church, especially by St. Augustine, it had been criticized also in this, because not all agreed with that. You have to think that all these debates were something that had not really been settled at this point into the church. There had been this great moment of debate into the late antique times. Then, the Middle Ages began, and people kind of grew forgetful of it. And even if these fears had such a huge influence on early medieval Christianity, and it is at this point that also through, the revival of the economy, the chances to study, and to really to be able to criticize, etc., there is the recovery of this of the fathers of the church, of these figures that had actually discussed about these problems, that were present also at the time, and that therefore could help to give a direction to essentially work as a model for the reform of the church itself. So the anti-Simoniac and anti-Nicolaist movements pose themselves the objective of moralizing the church, and very soon they managed to reach the most reforming branches of the same ecclesiastical hierarchy as ideologies, as proposals, and they were extremely important for providing the doctrinal tools to strengthen the role of the papacy, who was depicted by such movements as essentially the only authority that could legitimately confer or confirm the ecclesiastical dignities. So this was very important, because the papacy was being elevated as a sort of judge of the morals of the world church. So it followed accordingly that the same papacy had to be the most perfect model from that point of view, and taking a stand essentially to start to start telling essentially the clergy what to do, and reforming it, as a matter of fact. So this was, however, much more political as well, because the confirmation and the conferment or the ecclesiastical dignities implied that the papacy had to become the sole authority to intervene in the bishops' elections. And this was a very hot topic at the time, because it was essentially what the main criticism towards the Ottonian, the imperial policy had been about. As we said before, the German emperors had begun to monopolize the appointment of ecclesiastical titles, especially of the bishops, that had been the main figures through which the empire at this time was trying to counter the local nobility, etc. So this is interesting also because it wasn't just these reforming movements weren't really only about the poor people. Like we'll see now that were certain evangelical paparistic movements that were being born at this very time. But this whole thing was mostly born still from an aristocratic milieu, because even those aristocratic families that had been overthrown in their role of providers in the role of managers of the church, they had been removed by the Ottonian dynasty from the head of the dioceses, with and seeing the appointment of external figures that came sometimes even from other lands, like had been Germany. In the case of the Italic kingdom, we're saying, okay, let's back this reform of the church. Let's really be about this. Let's fight against the imperial authority that has taken away essentially our prerogatives in the appointment of the bishops. So this is how even a conflict like the one between, the one would have happened for the struggle of the ambassadors took place. The struggle for ambassadors wasn't something just between the papacy and the emperor. It was really something that went through the whole society quite transversely, and naturally the same. And the aristocracies were all one with this, because some were siding with the Pope, some were siding with the Emperor, and also in here it's not so simple after all, because every family had essentially different interests from this point of view. And both in Italy and in Germany, that were the countries that were, telling the truth, more affected by this by the struggle for investitures, and that therefore a struggle that engaged pretty much also the local aristocracies, and it put them once again at the center of this point. And this was actually a fight also between the by backing the church, you were definitely the reforming church. You automatically made you an enemy of the emperor in practice, and vice versa. And so also in here the question is a bit more complex and variegated, but the substance is really this. It was about also something that went beyond the strictly universal nature of the two powers, because Rome had this maybe telling truth, both the empire and the papacy at this time had a very long scale, long range influence on Christianity. But sometimes the struggle actually took much narrower means. Like, the papacy didn't want the German emperors to expand into Italy practice, because the popes at this time were by the way, expanding territorially as well into central Italy, and they didn't want the emperors to tell them what to do in there. So it's not just about a strictly moral problem, it's about the fact that you want to weaken the Germanic Empire so that you can do whatever you want into Italy. And there were lots of German princes that were quite happy about this, because they didn't like very much the imperial authority themselves into Germany, and they backed the church to essentially to get more autonomy for themselves in the German kingdom. Also, the clergy in this sense was split, because for instance, the Italic clergy was naturally more supportive of the Church of Rome by some standards. Not always. There were certain archbishops that, being quite powerful, they didn't want to give up their power to Rome, like Ravenna or Milan were actually opposed to Rome. They didn't want to give up. But there were lots of other Italian ecclesiastics, many other, say, Italian clergymen that instead saw extremely favorable reformation of the church, because this could give more power to Rome, to which they were directly tied, and that was a channel to eventually rise together with the church's fortunes into the ecclesiastical career in itself. Whereas in Germany, there were certain archbishops that were instead quite faithful to the emperor, because they were feared about the expansion of the local noblemen, and therefore wanted to back the only authority that could, in a certain sense, help them against them. In fact, if you see how the struggle for investitures finished, you realize that basically it was a compromise between how things had to be dealt into Italy and how they had to be dealt into Germany, and how the two temporal powers were, without, however, making ever fall the kind of the cooperation between the two powers as well. Because also this idea of, the emperor and papacy were one against the other. Not really. As a matter of fact, they also realized that as universal powers, if they had been combined, they also would have had a greater benefit in some occasions. And the Middle Ages at this point were not a time to which you could exclude the emperor or the pope, because in the public sphere there were certain public rights that pertained to the emperor necessarily all over Europe by right, by law, I mean. And as a Christian, that doesn't mean just an inner thing, but also living into the community that is structured, that is organized in a certain way, that is led by bishops and also all these monasteries with abbots, etc. It equated, the church was there, and it had everywhere, and it had to have its own hierarchy and to respond to the Pope. So it was impossible to make a sharp division in this sense. It is important, however, to stress as a cause of the Gregorian Reform this aversion towards, especially the politics that the Ottonians had started from the second half of the 10th century by relaunching, let's say, the engagement of the high clergy into the management of the political power. this had brought to very important political actions as well. Also conflicts, revolts against the emperors that had been countered by the same local clergy, and really dividing the local societies sometimes, with lay aristocracies, especially this in the Italic kingdom, that was adverse to the ecclesiastical aristocracy. That now had been, say, had passed from the Ottonian side. However, there is another very important factor that kind of prepared the road for the Gregorian reforms that I hinted at before. It is the development between the 10th and 11th century certain religious movements of so-called pauperistic inspiration. So these movements, we have been talking a lot about them on the channel. They were essentially, I've been discussing them chiefly for the later times, when they were eventually either eliminated or integrated and reframed, let's say, in the Reformed Church now. So in the Roman Church, as we know it in the post Gregorian times. So a church that now was well structured enough to essentially deal with this extremely wide phenomenon. So at this time we are still at the very beginning for both. And it's interesting to see how, in this sense, the reform of the church, say the strengthening of the creation of the papal monarchy and the spread of these pauperistic evangelical movements were actually part of the same thing at the origins. It was paradoxically the pauperistic movements that also triggered, ideally, the reform of the church. So naturally, as it's not known, the pauperistic movements essentially preached the evangelic ideal of poverty. So the renunciation to the secular goods and to the a bit of the coming back to the origins of the church. The church of the origins meant naturally not just as the as Christ's teaching, but also these first, say, also monastic practices that were pretty stern and pretty also positive in some measure to the social order. There was a lot of contrast to this, but we have said it many times when talking about the evangelic pauperistical movements. Behind them there wasn't just a strictly moral problem. There were many political, social, and especially economical problems. As it was evident in this Europe that was reviving from, let's say, a moment of relative contraction in the earlier Middle Ages, that there were many social differences at the time. There were extremely wealthy people, and there were very few in number, and many poor people. Now at the time it was normal, because more or less all the societies, the most advanced societies in the world at the time contemplated such differences, but sometimes they could be really jarring. And there were lots of people who had basically nothing to lose and began to criticize, also quite violently, how the social order was built. So the pauperistic movements also adhered to the anti-Simoniac and anti-Nicolaitans instances, but however they also perspective a more radical reform of the church. In fact, differently from what eventually the Gregorian Reform would have consisted in which eventually brought the same pauperistic movements to remain opposed to Rome in some measure. The pauperists wanted the church to abandon completely all its involvement into temporal matters. So this was naturally impossible to do. And such movements, in fact, were generally more external. There were the movements that were less connected with the ecclesiastical world. The pauperists were present especially into the cities, and they contested especially the local clergy. So they had sort of even a classist instance practically against the church, and they expected the Roman Church in this sense to take a stand against this local clergy, implying by fate that also the Roman Church had to be so completely pure and all. And this is something, yeah, of course, as we've said before, sometimes these pauperist movements were joined by people who really maybe didn't really care about Christian, about the Reformation of the church. We have to think about the ignorance that existed at the time, whereas people who just wanted something to eat, essentially, and that they didn't, instead of rather than starving to death, they preferred to fight, to rob, to even these extremely wealthy clergymen that were seen as those who were making them starve. But what I think is, however, that at a strictly religious level, especially the leaders of these pauperistic movements that had probably a bit more of a they were clever people. We know it from some of them would remain as important figures into Christian history. Eventually, they probably had true and genuine expectations for the purity of the church. What you have to answer the question: what did a person in the 11th century, let's say a relatively educated person into the 11th century, could think of the Church of Rome? Today we have a pretty secularized mind, so we think, well, okay, yeah, the church surely was important, but we have to really understand how the Church of Rome was a sort of a meta... I don't know how to say this, but the Church of Rome was probably a term that made trembling people who named it. It was seen as probably the greatest, even at this moment in which the Church of Rome was not still officially become the head of Christianity, but in practice was already extremely influential, was seen as the perfect standard, the perfect symbol of morality, of holiness at the time. So even people who had never been to Rome, they didn't know how it was. Surely politics at that time was very participated, really, probably even more than today in today's times. So probably people knew that also the Church of Rome suffered of these interference, either from the empire, from the local Roman nobility, but it was still felt to be owning some a special character of sorts that was these people appealed to in order to say, look at how here locally in this city, I don't know, our clergy is so corrupted, so please, Pope, look at this. Because something had to be changed. Now, of course, I'm making it simple, but the idea is that probably these people truly believed in the genuine holiness, in the genuine perfection of the Church of Rome, and looked with great expectation to a reformation, to a reform of the Church. The idea was also that, however, some of them had given up a little bit the same idea of finding a help from somewhere. I mean, even as I was saying before, the Roman Church was pretty much affected by the same problems that the Pauperists were denouncing. So even at this time, we have to understand the Pauperist movements as a tool that the popes began to use unexpectedly, apparently, to intervene into the local matters. So if you were a pope and say these movements started happening, as we will see with the Patarìa, for instance, in Milan, and you were against the local archbishop because you thought that it was too powerful, and as a pope from Rome, you wanted to extend your own control on the local Milanese church, well, it was very profitable to intervene in favor of these movements. And this is what happened in the case of the so-called Patarìa. So the Patarìa was this movement of pauperistic inspiration that was spread in Milan in around 11th century, and through the preaching of the diacon Ariald from Carimate, Arialdo from Carimate, and this movement, naturally, one problem historically speaking is that we don't really know excessively much. I mean, this is still 11th century Europe. We don't have so many sources. We don't know fully what this movement was. The sources are pretty scanty. They tell things in a rather superficial way, from at least compared to the one we would really like to know. And the Patarìa was involved into the clash that counterposed the reformer clergy to the local bishop. Even the name about the Patarìa is not really known. You know, it might have started actually as a derogatory term, as the Patarians were essentially conceived. It would mean etymologically like ragamuffins or ragmen, etc. So this also tells you, by the way, how, you know, what their social extraction really was, how their adversaries looked at these people, and it's pretty much obvious, because the clergy that was being criticized at this point was the highest, one of the highest level. It was the same Bishop of Milan. So all people who were aristocratic and had very strong bonds with international politics and were pretty much involved into worldly affairs, whereas the Patarians were connected to, even to the, partly also to some, definitely to the local clergy as well, but the small clergy, the medium clergy at best, and that was conceived in fact as kind of inferior, even from an intellectual point of view, from a social point of view. You have to really think at this point that the aristocrats felt, you know, from post-Carolingian times, there was an aristocratic adus that had strongly developed against also the inferior strata of the society, and that conceived itself like to be an elected class that had the right to rule. A right that in this sense was sanctioned also by the same fact that they were there, that were also chosen by God, that were the bishops of Milan, like in this case. So it's important to understand both sides, and to understand how, telling the truth, both sides had lots of interests that went far beyond the strictly reformation of the church. As it's normal, religious matters, telling the truth. And that's how also the popes start to intervene. And you have to think about a bit also of the shock that these papal siding actually brought to, because up to that point the Pope would have never sided against the lower strata of the population, against a bishop, by the way. This instead was an extremely it was probably unexpected by the same Paparistic movements, by some extent, and instead it happened, and it tells you how much was changing also into papal politics at that time, how it was transforming something much more dynamic, much cleverer as well, much less focused on much more capable also of understanding and intervening, of taking side, of taking a stand that in this sense also implied risks. So it's not the church that is traditionally set in this frame of the usual, only the ecclesiastical matters, but it's something that goes pretty straight at politics without even doing something that by that time had never been conceivable. Obviously the church always played politically in every time in history since its very beginning, but this was the symptom of a greater change, of a much greater awareness of the papal prerogatives as they were being formed, even ideologically speaking, at that time. So at this point the popes managed, through the Patarians, basically to bring the Milanese church under its own control, and this is all the more meaningful considering that the Milanese clergy was extremely proud about its autonomy. It's a bit what I was telling you about before, is that up to this time, and which is also something so extraordinary as an event, because up to this time every church had, by right, by ecclesiastical tradition, enjoyed a great autonomy, because every church, in theory, into Christianity, every bishop had the same authority. It was a very egalitarian model. Even archbishoprics and metropolitic seats were conceived as a sort of an administrative necessity, but there was no true hierarchical meaning attached to it when it got to eventually the power of the single, the decisional power of the single bishops in some measure, because this was also felt as a very ethical thing. I mean, being a bishop was a great meaning, and what had been built over it in terms, in fact, of archbishops and metropolites was seen as also in there as as a mostly practical need, and something that wasn't about hadn't to interfere in the good work, in the good pastoral work of the local bishops, ideally. So the Church of Milan at this point was extremely powerful, and Rome managed to impose its power on it. And this was part of that, how step by step you realize in here we're not already at the Gregorian Reforms proper, but there was still the progressive, there was already the progressive development of certain mindsets, certain chances, certain still certain options were still open that could be taken or not, and that's the path through which eventually the Gregorian Reforms developed. So the corruption of the Milanese clergy was in fact taken during the was taken by certain reforming exponents, especially in the second half of the 11th century, that church church, oh my god, what am I saying? That tried to strengthen the papal authority through this hierarchical subordination of local churches. And so this is all what kind of confirms the very deep intertwinement of different instances that sometimes could be as different as, the papal monarchy and the pauperistic movements, that however could bring together, even in this kind of contradictory form, that eventually came to characterize this age of the church, a reform of the church. So I don't have much to add. However, I know these videos now about especially the reform of the church are a bit getting around the main point, because I still haven't made a video about the reform of the church. But I think that these prodromes are very, very important to understand what the reform of the church was in the first place. The more I study history, let's say, the more I read about it, I realize that the moment of the origin is crucial, because you can't fully understand something if you don't understand its causes. So I could go straight talking about what the reform of the church was, but what the Gregorian reforms were, in fact, but it's still about how they how it was brought, how the thing evolved, and from which reasons, because as we were saying at the beginning of the video, there hasn't been not even a Gregorian reform proper. To tell it all, Gregory VII wasn't even the great reformer that when we think. There were much more important popes after him that eventually made it into what the Gregorian reforms and prerogatives and papal prerogatives would have really turned out to be. Gregory VII, by a certain extent, didn't even was even something temporary. I mean, by his death, the church could have taken a very different path. The Gregorian reforms might have not practically occurred as we know them. As I was saying before, I made a video that kind of explains this a little bit already, which is, let's go check. I know today it's, I don't feel that well, so Maybe the video is more boring than the usual, but I think the video is 11th century Rome, the rise of the reformers, I believe. And then it's plenty of other videos that deals with, especially evangelic patristical movements. But this is really that is interesting, because I also touch in there instead other factors that I didn't discuss today. As I was saying before, I discussed chiefly what the peculiar political situation of Italy brought to the Gregorian Reforms. There is something extremely more complicated than what I explained today, because you realize also in there that, you know, today I try to make big, broader, let's say, to trace certain broader reasons, certain factors that are somewhat also ideal. We talk about the Cluny reform. We talked about a bit this, also the Patarìans, the etc., the hermitism and all. But there were certain more strictly worldly causes that eventually brought to the Gregorian Reforms. I mean, if, for instance, if Tuscany hadn't been ruled by certain nobles, just there wouldn't have been certain figures that eventually contributed to the Gregorian Reform, including Gregory VII. I mean, to rise to that role. So it's really something that could have taken other paths, and the Gregorian Reforms are. I'm not a great expert in ecclesiastical history, but the more I study them and the more I realize how they changed everything into the Middle Ages. I mean, you can't properly understand the Middle Ages if you don't understand the Gregorian Reforms. And that's something I will be talking a lot about. And this thing of noticing how even a small event influenced and was crucial for triggering another bigger one is really a very, very important way to make history, to understand history. So this is more or less what I wanted to leave you with. So for now, I hope that you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.